Oh, I think we have officially reached some level of quorum. All right. I'm going to start rolling through our really sparse agenda, if that's okay with folks. All right, so first topic, user group formation. I was going to talk about that too. Somebody else put it in there. So, Phil, you want to go?
Yeah, I'll do it.
Or I think someone else recently wrote that.
I put it in there. This one. Is that what you're talking about? Okay, yeah, so user group governance and formation. We have a PR out, it's linked, it's been sent to the steering committee. This has gone through some discussion already, and a group of people who opted in to helping form the governance for user groups. The one point of, I think, discussion was like, what is the role of user groups? To what extent are they purely discussion groups, which anyone can use in any way, or the group can decide like how they're going to use the discussion group, but don't have a specific role or responsibility within the project. Another kind of philosophy behind them was user groups do have a role specific to driving, basing the work in the project with outside parties and users and that sort of thing, and help drive feature requests and that sort of thing. The proposal kind of landed on a user groups are welcome to perform activities which can result in driving that sort of thing, but they don't have a formal role per se, or they're not tracked in sort of that, in those responsibilities. Some of the open topics on the PR are about, sorry, the window keeps resizing, are about who kind of initiates sponsorship of the user group. I think, Tim, you had a comment about SIGs would potentially sponsor these things. The proposal as written says that they don't require any sort of sponsorship, but just send something to the steering committee. And then if it is the steering committee approving these, I think there's a question of like, do these things need the normal sort of quorum of steering committee approval, or is it just a lazy consensus with maybe one formal approval and then a lazy consensus period? So yeah, I'll open the floor to comments and questions or responses.
So Tim, your suggestion that the SIG, that there be such a thing as a sponsoring SIG, kind of implies you think that user groups hierarchically should fall underneath of a SIG. Is that... Well,
the question is like, where would we fit it inside of SIG.YAML then if we didn't have, because everything in SIG.YAML is kind of a hierarchical structure. Would it be like similar to working groups? Sorry, kids are wrestling.
So, I mean, right now they're listed as a top level entity such that they would roll up to steering as their escalation point of last resort. And yeah, Tim, you're breaking up a little bit. So I think what I heard you say is similar to how working groups have stakeholder SIGs, you would like user groups to have sponsoring SIGs. And so it's not so much a hierarchy of relationship, but just useful to know that the two entities are related or whatever. There's a link between them. That seems okay. I thought you were implying like a hierarchy, like you wanted to allow SIGs to create user groups rather than have this roll up to the steering committee.
I think if it rolls up to the steering committee, it seems, I don't know.
Can you maybe type what you were?
I don't know. I work a user. If you're breaking up, I'm sorry. Why don't I hold my?
I think we should discuss Brian's feedback. I mean, what would big data roll up into? Like, let's just play it out.
Yeah, I think that's a good point because I don't see it rolling up. In fact, actually, we created user groups specifically because we thought there wasn't a good home for big data and it shouldn't be a SIG.
And then Tim St. Clair just said it should roll up into app.
I'll put it this way, so for working groups, it was necessary to have the information about stakeholder SIGs because working groups can't own code. So it's really useful to know what are the SIGs that own code, right? It's unclear to me what the use or value would be of having a stakeholder SIG for a user group.
Yeah, I agree.
Could I give an example?
Sure.
Just by way of exploring the space here a little bit. So, one of my concerns about combining SIG AWS into the cloud provider SIG is that we do actually have a reasonable number of users who show up, like end users who show up, because that's a good place for them to kind of interact with the community and get advice. And so like a AWS user, Kubernetes on AWS user group would seem like a reasonable thing to propose and would pretty clearly fall under either cloud provider or SIG AWS, however we're thinking about that these days. That's just one example, but it feels like that's the kind of pattern we ought to support.
I guess I view it this way.
I don't think anybody's precluding that.
So I'm really wary of user groups being a place where the project blesses certain end user solutions. I'm not sure that any of us want that. And so I have concerns that associating the user group with entities that are in charge of parts of the project, code that belongs in the project, kind of makes that association. I'm completely in favor of having a cloud user group or user groups for specific clouds. That seems like a great idea. It's unclear to me why we need to tie the two together formally.
Yeah, I feel like we
one
should
thing.
Sorry, Brian or Brendan, your connection is just as bad as Tim. It's impossible to hear you.
Okay, I won't talk.
So one thing I would say is that we don't necessarily need sponsorship from a SIG, but it might be useful as part of the metadata for a user group to essentially say, here's the associated SIG so that folks know kind of what this is about. I don't think it has to be super official.
I think my only reservation about going up to the steering committee was that it gets addressed in a fairly timely fashion. We're usually pretty overloaded, and sometimes issues that come before us in the past have kind of rotted for a while until poked excessively. So I just wanted to make sure if people wanted to create a user group that, SIGs are usually very responsive. So that was my only point of contention on the issue.
And if we made the bar just one or two steering committee members and lazy consensus after that, if nobody objects, that might address that problem. That's the approach CNCF has taken with sandbox projects, and it has pros and cons, but I view these things as being useful to the user community. So I don't think there should be an excessively high bar, just some sanity checking to prevent overlap and stuff like that, right? I mean, basically it's a discussion forum where people can go and share information and ask questions and discuss challenges and stuff like that.
Yeah, so 2 sponsoring steering members, and we can just do the GitHub org thing and be done with it, right?
Yeah, I mean, GitHub notifications are hard, but
no, I mean, just people request for repositories and adding members. So people usually do an issue and a PR for that, so we can follow the same pattern.
That's actually exactly what I recommended on the original proposal, was just have one or two steering committees members explicitly act, and then use a lazy consensus. And I think if we send it to steering committee mailing list and then throw it on the agenda for the next steering committee mailing list, just to say this is happening, that seems like sufficient.
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
I agree. I do feel like generally the steering committee has been responsive when like there's a call for, hey, here's a PR, we need you to like apply your LGTMs or vote on the PR. They've generally been responsive. So I'm not sure how concerned I am about reducing the number of people, but if everybody else feels like it's too.
It's been hard to get like 2/3 of people to LGTM just because.
If we're referencing the difficulty of working group formation, I have found it to be more difficult to go get SIGs, the sundry SIGs to sponsor than I have to get steering committee members to vote.
I think the 2 solves the problem, and I'm fine with it. I think that was my only point of contention. So unless other people have other issues, we can probably move along. I think there was a minor comments about like what the GitHub directory meant. I think multiple people were confused by that, but we can probably take that particular one offline.
Yeah, I mean, we can always reevaluate when we get to like 30 user groups or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
The only thing I was worried about was like people taking specific things, topics, and saying that this belongs to us. You cannot do. There can't be any other user groups that talks about the same thing.
Yes,
I'm not sure about that.
I tried to clarify, tried to explicitly avoid that by putting in anti-goals that essentially says they don't create any roles or make Kubernetes project decisions or produce or own any project deliverables or assets. If there's any other stronger word you want to put in there around maybe owning topics, they don't own topics, they just have them available for discussion.
So basically we should encourage, it's okay, we should give permission to say it's okay for multiple sets of people to talk about the same thing.
Yeah,
or similar things. There can be overlap, basically.
There's probably going to be a topic that spans 2 things. Yeah.
Okay. Thank
you. Are there any more questions, comments, complaints, concerns about the user group formation?
I mean, I want to explicitly remove the concept of sponsoring SIGs, otherwise I'm good with it.
It's not in the document, so we can just
then good.
The comment. The next topic I moved up, DIMS, I'm sure that you probably wrote this one, kube batch volcano change.
Right, I wanted to give a heads up to people here because there is some traffic going on in the SIG scheduling as well as SIG apps, I think. So basically, the rub was that SIG scheduling owns kube batch. It's in SIGs in Kubernetes SIGs GitHub org, but there are people working on kube batch who wants to expand the scope of the project, and the proposal was to, they came up with the name first. Maybe it's better for me to invite Quinton here. Quinton, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Could you speak a little bit about what they are trying to do?
Sure. So it did actually originate out of a broader problem, which was solving a lot of batch-related things, many of which are related to big data and machine learning tasks. For not necessarily good reasons, they called the thing kube batch in the beginning because that was its initial focus, but it actually was sort of phase 1 of a bigger plan to address more of, a broader set of issues that those kinds of workloads run into on Kubernetes. So they cover other things like application management, lifecycle, pod lifecycle, access to accelerators, data flow optimizations. I'm not doing a very good job of using all the right terminology, but you get the picture that big data machine learning applications, when you run them on Kubernetes, they run into a whole range of problems, and it kind of doesn't matter what whether you're using Spark or TensorFlow or whatever, you tend to run into the same set of problems. And this was an attempt to solve a range of those problems. So that broader scoped effort has come under the name Volcano, and is actually, the logical extension of what was called kubebatch. And kubebatch started off in SIG scheduling, I believe. And it's been pointed out that the broader scope overlaps a bit into other SIGs. And so the combined proposal here is, one, to rename the thing from kubebatch to Volcano to reflect the broader scope. And I believe they have spoken to SIG scheduling and SIG apps, and I think that's it. Dim's correct me if I've missed anything here. So we just wanted to make sure that everybody was kind of okay with what was going on here, and that the right approvals had been, the right process had been followed.
Hey Quentin, this is Derek. I had a question. One of the issues I saw in the Volcano project documentation was it talked about alternative container runtimes like Singularity. I'm not sure if that's actually in or out of scope. And then some of the issues you talked about around things like accelerators and pod lifecycle, I don't know if they're creating another pod execution agent or not, but that's the type of thing that also I think was not clear in the description.
Oh, that's a good point. So there is actually overlap with SIG node as well, because some of the accelerator stuff and certainly the container runtime stuff definitely, overlaps with SIG node. And so, yes, I think that I don't know if they've actually explicitly discussed that with SIG node yet. But certainly there's a recognition that is the case. So, and I can certainly get them to come and tell you in more detail exactly what the thinking is there, and to what extent SIG node wants to get involved. To be clear, maybe also just to take one step back. So some of the stuff that gets done in this project, this Volcano project, could conceivably be incorporated into Kubernetes over time. You can imagine, an improved batch scheduler, and that's, some of the work has been happening with SIG scheduling, and improved, or different container runtime, etc. May well be, consumed into the core of the product, or at least into the purview of the specific SIGs. The thinking was that rather than do that as a first phase, focus on getting the stuff working in a sort of separate project, a bunch of plugins and alternative schedulers, alternative kubelets, for example. And then once it's been proven out and proven to be useful, offer it up to the SIGs for consumption if they so wish. Somebody's making a lot of noise.
It sounds like someone's making tea in a kitchen. That makes sense. And I guess what I'm wondering is how we map this back to other projects that have come up, and then if the scope of Volcano is as big as it's implied, like, are there other homes, like just as a CNCF project, that would make more sense as?
Yes, definitely. That has been floated. Given that given that kubebatch is already a SIG-sponsored project with a home and everything, we figured that was a good place to start. But it's sort of minimally disruptive. And to be clear, this kubebatch is used, for example, by Kubeflow and quite a few other upstream consumers. So we didn't want to kind of rock the boat too heavily here. But yes, it could certainly, once it gets a little bit more momentum, that this expanded scope could certainly be, kind of kicked up to the CNCF and out of the Kubernetes context. It is Kubernetes specific at the moment, so it is very squarely aimed at running these jobs on Kubernetes. And so I don't know to what extent we like kicking up stuff to the CNCF, which is, entirely focused on Kubernetes. But other than that caveat, what you say makes perfect sense.
This is Bobby also. Sorry, I was a little late. I had an overlap. But anyways, we had a discussion about this in SIG scheduling as well. And I think the scope is certainly larger than just SIG scheduling. But in a discussion that we had last time, I asked Klaus specifically if there is any plan to donate this project to CNCF, and he said no. I don't know if anything has changed since then, or maybe he didn't know about the whole process of open sourcing a larger project. Based on what you just said, Quentin, I think it's possible that you want to donate the project to CNCF and make it like a maybe separate project, right?
Yes, certainly have not excluded that as an option. We'll see where it goes.
Okay, sounds good. Based on the current plan, I believe this is certainly beyond the scope of just SIG scheduling, and it may not make sense to keep it as a SIG repo.
Well, that was questions is what do we do about a repo that kind of straddles multiple SIGs?
I mean, it's honestly, such a repo is a larger project in my opinion. It's not just a simple small project anymore if it spans multiple SIGs. And I feel like Volcano falls into that category. And if it's a larger project which spans multiple SIGs and has a lot of, in a way, like parallel logic to existing Kubernetes logic, we should consider it as a separate project. That's my take.
So, I mean, the other way we could model this would be as a working group with a charter around the working group to essentially motivate and sort of describe the set of features across SIGs. Having an overarching KEP that talks about sort of what this thing looks like makes sense also. For me, one of the things that bothers me about this is that it has like a non-descriptive name, which is something that we've tended to sort of shy away from for subcomponents of Kubernetes. It sort of implies sort of, you know, when you give a name like that, it implies sort of an open-ended scope versus something that is more targeted towards a scenario.
I share your distaste for mumbo jumbo names, and we could certainly, you know, names come from the people who come up with these projects sometimes, and I don't think that one's been particularly closely scrutinized. I agree. I would prefer to have a semantic name associated with the project.
Right. So then the question here becomes, what is the decision-making process here that we need to follow? And basically, the main thing that we are, you know, putting a hold on right now is the rename of the repository from kubebatch to Volcano. So, so that's a decision. Who needs to make that decision? That's the question.
I think we should. I feel like we should hold the rename because I feel like the two options are working group or external project, and that SIG sponsored is not a good answer here.
But sorry, just to clarify, so working groups don't build code. So this is a code project. There's tons of code here. There's code already, and there's more code currently being built.
The idea, though, is the working group would be the same set of people, but figuring out which SIG should own which pieces of code. Since it seems like this effort is working on code that spans multiple SIGs, the working group would be in charge of figuring out which SIG should be owning these pieces. And if you're not interested in taking that approach, then figuring out how to extract out seems like the next approach.
Sorry, I may be naive here, but what's the motivation for putting it in this particular repo? Like, if it started off as a scheduling component, like why does all these other sort of ideas need to go into this repo?
I have the history here with Klaus, so I know what he's thinking.
Okay.
But it's broader in scope. I understand why he's doing it this way, but I don't. It does make sense. It is a logical choice for the current type of workloads that he's trying to address. But at the same time, like, I do agree with everything else that's been said. I do think it's so broad in scope that it doesn't fall underneath the purview of a SIG-sponsored repository. And it likely, that's not a good home for it. And I think the CNCF would be a much better home in the long term.
But I mean, I would kick this back to them and say, like, do you want to be a working group? Do you want to be a working group, or do you want to be Helm, where Helm lived under SIG apps for a really long time, really outgrew it, and became its own CNCF project? And so I feel like we should take a lesson from that and say, either you think you're a working group and you're going to disband at some point, or you think you're a separate project like Helm. And
I would argue that the working group discussion can happen in parallel. The reality is there is code at the moment that already exists and is used by external projects. And there is additional code that is being added to that and making the repository name no longer suitable. So I think that's, kind of problem number one. As I mentioned, the decision whether to upstream this into the SIGs, all of this stuff into the SIGs or into the core of Kubernetes or into the CNCF seems like a next step decision to take. And the CNCF seems totally reasonable. The only caveat I have there is that it's only Kubernetes and only ever will be Kubernetes. So does it make sense to have things that are strictly extensible pushed up to the CNCF?
That's a decision for the TOC to make. So I think they just need to try it.
Well, and also concretely, Helm is exactly in the same boat, right? Helm is a CNCF project. Helm is totally dedicated to Kubernetes. So we even have prior art that says it's okay. I guess from my perspective.
Sorry, let me just quickly respond to that. So Helm was actually a Kubernetes project, and we kicked it out. And so I'm sort of.
Well, we didn't kick it out.
No, Helm asked to leave. In all honesty, they asked to leave.
Okay. I don't have all the history there, but suffice to say,
part of it was that we were actually exerting sort of more sort of consistency across the projects that actually conflicted with some of what Helm was doing, and so that was one of the things that actually. Yeah, I see you, Brian. That's one of the things that actually, I think induced them to actually want to move to the CNCF. But I think it's the same sort of thing. We're trying to say, hey, what's the consistency? What's the right thing for this to do with Volcano? We can either figure out a way to actually sort of fit this into the Kubernetes structures that we have, or the CNCF is a good answer.
Okay, I'm going to say Brian, and then we should probably time box pretty soon.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, we have several TOC members on, and Quentin, I know you're still involved as well. Being Kubernetes specific is absolutely 100% not a blocker for being an independent project in the CNCF. There were lengthy discussions about that when creating the sandbox, and also when Helm moved in, and there are other projects like Rook that are there. We explicitly wanted a home where projects could land, so they didn't all just have to land in Kubernetes. As Kubernetes expands in terms of usage, there are going to be more and more of these projects. So that is actually absolutely intended to be a home for Kubernetes specific projects.
Okay. Are there any focus time box talking points that we want to?
One last thing I wanted to say is to Quentin's first point about, hey, we have this repo now. I feel like that's specifically why we asked SIGs to own code. So SIG scheduling needs to decide if they're comfortable with the current state of the repo, or if changes are necessary. It's not a steering committee decision.
Well, if we think it's outside the scope of the SIG, then becomes a steering committee thing.
Yeah, exactly. So we discussed it.
Yeah, except for I feel it the other way. It's sort of like if scheduling says, hey, we think it's outside of the scope, then we say, okay, the answers are working group or separate project.
Yeah. I guess that's what Bobby's saying, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Then I think we say to Klaus and whoever, working group or separate project.
Yeah. Okay.
I think I understand. I'll take that back to the Volcano team and get them to put a plan together based on this understanding that I've got now. Thank you. That was very useful.
Okay. I think for the purposes of time, we have other agenda items to walk through. And I want to make sure that we're courteous of everyone's time here. So, Brian, you had a topic next, the velocity report.
Yeah, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I just want to give people a heads up. The velocity report was mailed out to the maintainers list. Everybody on the steering committee should be on that list. If you're not, we should get that rectified. So just take a look. If there are things that we want from it that are not in it, we should provide them the CNCF that feedback. If it's not useful, we can decide whether we care or not. But they've been sending these reports every quarter for like a year and a half at least. So anyway, the information is there. We can also decide to share it more broadly within the project. It's a world readable link. I don't know who else would care. We don't have like a SIG marketing exactly. CNCF does that. But yeah, this slide is kind of interesting just because it's use cases and concerns. So some of the SIGs might be interested in that, the key messages slide. But anyway, just take a look and we can have follow-up discussion on the mailing list if people have any thoughts.
Sounds good. Next up, Aaron, update to sub-project owners.
Yes, sorry. So this was a follow-up from last time we started talking about SIG Cloud Provider and how they wanted the concept of people that were common across all of their sub-projects, but that they also wanted like individual repositories to have, you know, technical leads or expertise. And so this reminded me, we don't actually have a very tight machine readable definition of sub-project owners. There are a number of ways listed on how to do that there. I kind of feel like it falls down to whether or not we want to add a new field called owners to owners files and then enforce that. And then there's a question of whether or not we want this to be defined in a decentralized manner or in a central location. I feel like ultimately wherever it's defined, it needs to be reconciled to the other location for user friendliness. So in the next comment below, I have a link taking a look at what if we just assume that sub-project owners were the set of approvers who are common across all of the owners files that are listed for all the sub-projects, and I've identified, yeah. So all of the warnings there talk about any sub-project that doesn't have common approvers amongst their owners files. I could keep going in that direction and find like where there's commonality and suggest. We could do the thing where we define sub-project owners centrally in SIG's YAML and then propagate it out the same way that we do for SIG leads, user group leads, working group leads and stuff. I just wanted to take a straw poll to see if anybody here cares or how they feel about it.
I like what you just said, Aaron, so I'm okay with that.
So SIGApps was just going through this process of rationalizing the owners files for the workloads APIs, which are spread over at least several subdirectories within Kubernetes. So they've had a strong need to have a central location where they have those lists of at least approvers and reviewers and ideally owners. So they put it in with the aliases in the top level owners file. So it needed a top level approver to do that refactoring and to make subsequent changes. But that seems like a good approach. SIG API machinery, I think, is the poster child for being spread across lots of repos. So I could easily see them needing a multi-repo centralization.
SIG storage is my other canonical example where they're spread across multiple repos and multiple orgs, both inside of the Kubernetes repo for some of their staging repos, as well as all the individual CSI repos and some of the packages inside of the Kubernetes repo. So I still eventually want to live in a world where most of this is defined by GitHub team. Most of this lands in GitHub teams that can then be referenced everywhere. But it's about like getting to that source of truth of who authoritatively should be in those GitHub teams. So like if there are no objections, I'm going to start with the like seeing who the common approvers are and trying to like gradually reconcile from there. But this was the AI I had to kind of follow up on sub-project owners meeting the needs of SIG Cloud Provider. So yeah, ultimately I want like Kubernetes org to have the files that drive all of the GitHub teams so that we use a PR-based process to update who belongs in which team, and that can be sharded out to different SIGs. So SIG release today has the final say on who ends up in SIG release related teams. SIG node has the final say on who ends up in SIG node related teams. What we lack is the automation to tie those teams to repos, to tie those teams to owners files, the automation to connect the SIG's YAML definition with making sure all that stuff lives. I don't want to go like super deep on this. I'm just trying to address the needs that seem to be expressed by SIG Cloud Provider and see the work to polish it for the rest of the stuff.
I think we've had this need for a really long time, ever since we originally wanted to break up the repository. So I think it's a good idea. And I think we've talked about it several times before. At least I know we've mentioned it offhand, but
right. I think the one other key thing I'm trying to advocate for here is that I not add another field to owners files. That like we live with the approvers and reviewers fields that we have today rather than try to complicate our contributor ladder. But I can be convinced otherwise.
Does that mean we would also not have a team, a GitHub team that includes owners?
We could add GitHub teams, but I think like I view this more as a social construct. So the owners file in the ideal world would have approvers, and then it could have like subproject-owners and subproject-approvers. So that they both have approve rights. Maybe for those subprojects that are in fact hierarchical, the top level owners file would only have subproject-owners. Yeah, there is a PR in flight to add an emeritus field, but it's not going to be parsed or consumed by our machinery. Whereas I feel like to ensure that subproject owners are empowered, they need to be in a field that is consumed by our machinery. Like to me, subproject owners are most often the people who are in charge of collaborating and coordinating the work of the subproject, making sure that everybody is working on the same thing. They're humans that you need to know as a point of contact. They're the people who are most likely to run the subproject meetings. They're the people that you're most likely to ping when you go in the subproject's Slack channel. So right now, what I'm going to try and do is take a look at all the common approvers in the owners files and then try and pull those back into SIG's.YAML and see.
Because this affects so many people, I think it makes perfect sense that a KEP be written down, at least to talk about the intricacies of who's to be affected and et cetera, just so other people have the opportunity to comment because it does affect so many people. I don't think it's controversial. This is not a controversial thing, but I think it sounds KEP worthy if we're going to integrate multiple people, multiple processes, and multiple systems.
Okay. I will follow up with that later.
Are there any other group topics, or should we move on?
Joe would much rather have a definition of the members of a subproject, and then owners call out which subproject they're a part of, right? So we could do that by having labels called subproject/foo. We already have a labels field today.
We can take it up in a cap. I just want to say, like, I think right now we have a bunch of names splattered everywhere. It's kind of confusing.
We do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Bring it together. So we can move on.
All right. Thanks.
Are there other topics that folks want to discuss before we walk through the backlog? This kind of this particular conversation overlaps with one of the new inbound issues that I created. Should we just move on to that, or are there other things going once, twice, 3 times? All right. New issues on the steering repo. I figured we triage those new inbound issues just so that we give them a home and we know that they're being addressed. There were 2 issues that were created recently. One was by Tim Pepper called leadership trainings. There was actually 3. There was the quorum one. This one's not controversial, and we are Aaron already added it to the milestone. I think we just need to, it's already been merged, so I think we can probably close this. Is that okay?
Yes, I just want to make sure we mentioned it out loud here.
Merge with a quorum of 1, perfect.
Leadership trainings. I don't know if anyone's had a chance to review this one at all. He's basically calling for, I don't know if this belongs in steering, to be honest. I think this is this almost sounds like the contributor ladder / Contribex thing.
My feeling was Contribex, and then it's going to need money, and then so the docs that we're working on for how to get money.
Can I tie it to your funding issue and close this one?
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, it should be punted to Contribex overall, though. Contribex already knows how to get money.
Yes, we do.
right. The one that I opened here was part of the volcano question plus other questions that were coming up, which was basic sets of governance around sub-projects, because there were a bunch of questions that came up for volcano, as well as other questions that were ongoing. So one of them is like, what rules apply to sub-projects if its core depends on if the core depends on it, right? So like we typically say the core has certain constructs or barriers to entry, certain guarantees, or for lack of a term, quality of service. But what about things like CNI? What about things like CRI and CSI? Like just the basic interface projects, for example. We don't actually have rules for things like that. Or if you go to things like add-ons, is a much more concrete example. We have this conversation currently about like what does it mean to be an add-on, and does that fall underneath the if they're done as CRDs, like what space does it live in, right? What namespace?
I have a question, Tim. Are you referring to the design and implementation of the interfaces, or of the plugins that interface with the core through those interfaces?
I'm talking about the policies that we have around these, and policies and governance rules we have around these. So for example, a very concrete example is the namespace in which you create a CRD, because right now everything, even things that are outside of the purview of the core, have like kh.io, right, inside the namespace of the CRD that's being created. And it probably shouldn't be. We should probably have some type of hierarchical mechanism for this. We don't really have that defined. So as we have these like layers where the core depends upon it, but it's outside the core, then we might want to have a stratification for there. That's one example. Then there's there was basic questions about governance with regards to voting, right? Like, right, the question about Volcano was, who gets to decide when a sub-project is created? We kind of do it slightly differently, and I think the governance model itself needs a little bit of refinement of voting versus chair sponsorship. Because if in this case, Bobby came back to us, but in the current model, I believe he could have done things arbitrarily. And I think a voting mechanism to have a conversation is much more fortuitous. But this is an example of 3 issues that required clarification. And I think it's pretty important, and it's been coming up repeatedly. So I'll stop there and see if folks have comments.
To the voting issues specifically, our governance template actually says that voting with lazy consensus is what you try first, with fallback to leads, or to fall back to chairs and technical leads. In practice, I think everybody has just gone directly to chairs. I don't think I have seen anybody, with the exception of contributor experience, go on a lazy consensus vote for sub-project creation.
We do a very long lazy consensus vote on SIG cluster lifecycle.
So we could try to update the language to like that fallback to chairs doesn't happen unless it's proven that a lazy consensus has been tried. Would that address your third point?
I think it's the second one. It's the second point.
Oh yeah, second point.
Possibly, yeah. So I think if somebody wants to take ownership to this and possibly PR, and we can discuss the options and changes. There's a couple of other issues that Bobby brought up with regards to language around sub-projects, making it more explicit about the guarantees of what sub-projects provide. Just because it has Kubernetes somewhere in its name, that doesn't mean it's quote unquote, the same thing as Kubernetes.
Yeah, I still think that's an important issue because, I was actually having a conversation with Brian as well about this, that sometimes the fact that a project is sponsored by Kubernetes brings this notion of trustworthiness with it. And we as SIG leads cannot really have full control over every single line of code that goes into these projects. So there is no guarantees of quality. And also, worse is the case that, I don't know, a few years down the road, people may change, some of these project owners may change, and then God knows what goes into these projects. If there is a vulnerability or even worse, a malicious code checked into these projects, it could cause quite a bit of reputation for the project, for Kubernetes.
So with respect to the terminology of core, I feel like that's sort of to me, that sounds a lot like SIG architecture owning the definition of what is and is not Kubernetes. So I question whether or not some of these questions should first be handled by SIG architecture as opposed to steering, in terms of better defining the interfaces to and around core.
So I actually have a simple answer to this one, which is if it's in the part of the main Kubernetes release, then there's a very increasingly clear bar and test suites and governance of that. And then we have kind of everything else at the moment.
Yeah, I wanted to echo a conversation that we had last meeting about sort of like what goes into the release and how do we actually decide what's in the release? Because at the end of the day, that's the artifact we're producing, and a lot of this other stuff is noise.
Yeah, so I think it would be
what Kubernetes is. Yeah.
Yeah, if we create some clarify a standard bar for the release itself, then we could work with SIG testing and SIG release and SIG docs about, if other subprojects meet that bar, what does that mean?
But again, I feel like when I asked about this question at the community meeting last week about, so who's in charge of defining what goes into the Kubernetes release as we try to live in a world where it's more than just code in the main repo? Joe, you vociferously said that this was SIG architecture's responsibility. And so again, I feel like this is a SIG architecture question if that's what everybody else here feels.
I think there's pieces of SIG architecture and there's pieces of governance in my statement here, but I agree that there are pieces of both.
Yeah, and just terminology-wise, there are subprojects that roll up into the Kubernetes releases and that are part of Kubernetes. So there are different flavors of subprojects.
And those definitely we want to hold to the quality bar we want to test. Those are things that I think we want to make sure that we track at a different level.
Right. I think what I'm trying to articulate what is steering's responsibility here versus what are we trying to explicitly delegate. So I feel like the voting bullet point here is steering's responsibility, making sure that we've got that like clearly defined and articulated. It's unclear to me what else actually falls under steering.
Yeah,
I think the language of the guarantees should probably be steering versus Arch.
Yeah, I agree with Tim. I think we should have like clear policies and maybe some guidelines as well for users. Don't just think about us in the community, in our smaller community. Think that there are like, I don't know, thousands of people who go to KubeCon, and I'm pretty sure there is another 10x number of users who use Kubernetes, and maybe someday try some of these sub projects. And we need to have some concrete information for those folks who want to try anything. And if we have higher bar for core versus non-core, maybe we should explicitly advertise those. Maybe we should put a bar on GitHub for these projects to say that these are SIG sponsored or Kubernetes sponsored, but that do not necessarily have the same standard as the core or whatever. It's something very clear.
I think that's an interesting idea. I think as we potentially break up Kubernetes, we need another signal to actually say, hey, this is something that is part of the core. And like we could define that, like we have, we come up with a name, core subprojects versus ancillary subprojects. And we define core as ones that actually the code ends up in our release, because there's a higher level of responsibility around those things. I see Aaron's very excited about this idea.
Yeah, I am not sure of the value of increased stratification here. I think like it's worthwhile to be explicit about what SIG sponsorship or ownership of a subproject implies, but I'm not sure I'm interested in now SIGs get to differentiate between their core and their non-core projects. I feel like the bar that Brian articulated, like does this subproject end up going into a Kubernetes release or not, should dictate what that project is held to. I don't feel like that's necessarily.
So
I think bringing clarity here, though. I'm sorry, go ahead, Tim.
I think what we can probably do is assign a couple of people to make PRs with regards to some of these bullet points. And I agree with you, Aaron, that some of it overlaps with Arch. And the ones that are steering related probably can break down in a comment. Perhaps we can break down the items and take a couple of people to get assigned to this. And maybe a couple of people can then go to Arch and talk about the other aspects of it. Does that seem like a fair way for us to prevent the bike shedding? Because this really does overlap. There's pieces that can be broken apart in two separate parts.
That's fair.
Yeah, that's fair. I just want to say one thing. We've tried this both ways in OpenStack, and it was a nightmare either way. So I would not recommend more stratification than what we have now. But I'm willing to share that with anybody who wants to work on this one.
I'd rather like get our release process super awesome so that all of the expectations are validated along the way, getting the release out the door. Yeah.
Are there folks who want to work on this?
Sure, you put my name in there. Why not? I mean, I'm interested in some of it. Yes.
There's also, I have a list of people who are interested in working on the user group governance. So I can message those folks. Maybe they could at least help, either from a review perspective and discussion perspective, or potentially for PRs as well.
Joe, did you want to be involved in this?
Sure. Yeah, no, I do. Thanks.
All right, I'm not going to send it to the milestone for the time being because we're checking near the end. So just a quick overview of the current milestone. We have 10 items. There's several of them are currently active. I do know that I kind of wanted to walk through the ones that haven't been discussed already. We already talked about the user group formation that's just needs final approval. Yeah. And Brendan sent out an email, and I wanted to make sure that he had a chance to talk about it too as well with regard to funding and budget. Or Brandon, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, just if people want to review it, I tried to just take a swing at what funding, how to request funding from the CNCF might look like. So, not much else to say. People want money from the CNCF on behalf of Kubernetes, and we need to define a process.
Okay.
The doc is only 1.5 pages, so it's not too long to review.
Great. Does anyone want to sign up to review real quick, just so at least we have eyes on and somebody commits to it?
I will.
Yeah, add me too.
All right.
Thank you.
We have T-minus 5 minutes. Code of conduct documentation, I'm guessing that there's no update. I looked at it and there was no update. Michelle is not around.
There is going to be a pull request that's going to come through either today or tomorrow for the charter.
Cool. Today or tomorrow?
Correct. Yeah, I'll ping my group right now, or I'll ping the group right now.
Community resource management.
The Slack one, Tim.
Okay.
Yeah.
George, do you want to give an update here?
Hello, sorry, my Zoom was freezing up. Yeah, we're meeting with Michelle to talk about this in about an hour.
Okay. Right. Find home for unowned areas of the project. We talked about docs at length last time. And I do believe that Paris had mentioned that there was a spreadsheet that was maintained somewhere about these other areas.
I know we just keep a list of all of our communication channels, and I have yet to PR that in.
Current owners are Paris and Aaron. I think Aaron was there because of the conversation about docs. Can I remove Aaron and just get a concrete list of things that are not currently owned from you soon?
Well, so what confuses me here is the top description here is talking about like code and GitHub stuff, and Paris is talking about communications channels, and I'm not sure if we're missing something here.
Well, I thought there was an original list. When we first had the conversation about this, there was supposed to be a list of items of things that were not owned by the project, where docs was a good example of one of them. And we talked at length about docs, and then we found that apparently SIGDocs will own that in the long haul. But what was not listed here was the actual concrete list that somebody has been curating over time.
Yeah, no, my list is only communication platforms.
Yeah, and the original motivation was when we were forming all the SIGs and rationalizing which SIG owned what, and defining the scope in each SIG charter. There were some things that for a long time were known to be falling through the cracks, like the things in the list in the original issue. Like the build system literally just came up this morning, and Tim posted a role to the role board to ask for someone to own the build system because there are some things that need to be addressed there. So that was the original intent of the issue. There are other assets of the project like communication platforms and whatever that have, we've taken on over time since the original issue was filed, and that is sort of a different but also important issue.
So what I'm hearing is we don't have a list. So we could have somebody go through and read all of the SIG charters and attempt to rationalize if they think anything is missing from that. That feels a little Herculean to me.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think just doing it if it's a problem, recognizing that, oh, we don't have an owner, let's go find an owner is probably a more practical approach to that. Like the build system. There's no.
I think that would fall under the release engineering subproject of SIG release at this point.
I would be fine with that.
Which I think Tim Pepper said he was fine with it as a SIG release chair. So I guess what I'm trying to say is everything discussed up in the description has been addressed. Paris is putting in the communications channels. We don't know of a list that exists. I think we can close this. What do you think?
Yeah, should we just create like a way of filing issues for other things, like a meta issue for new things we discover, and then?
I would expect those to just roll in as new issues. Hey, I found something that doesn't seem to have an owner. Please find one.
Yeah, I would agree.
Okay.
I'm fine with closing it.
Yep.
Yes.
All right, we are at time too. So if folks could take a look at the backlog, and by next time, I'll do a little bit more advisory in the week in between, and then I'll write up a doc with regards to sort of the current process that I followed, and we can refine that over time.
Sounds good.
Great.
Great. We're losing
Take
our
care,
routine. Happy Wednesday.
Okay.